Hi again, Stephanie, your fellow accessibility engineer and instructor. So I've been getting a lot of accessibility questions from my students, and I thought to just make a video to answer some of them. I also included a link to the first video I made a few years ago. So the first question is, what advice do you have for someone just starting out in accessibility? And I think if there's one thing you must absolutely know, no matter what type of accessibility specialist you want to be, is to know the WCAG. And that's going to be useful for everyone. And this is the baseline. So yeah, you just need to know the WCAG. And you'll be surprised how many people I've interviewed for jobs and they don't know the WCAG. And you can spot them easily because they don't know the difference between conformance and compliance. So the WCAG is not a governing body. The WCAG only provides a set of standards and guidance. Now it's up to governments to make laws that will force companies to comply to those laws. And governments usually use WCAG as the basis of their laws. So you cannot comply to the WCAG because the WCAG is not going to send a bunch of cops to shut down your company if it's not accessible, but the government can sue you if your website is not accessible. So that's the difference between conformance and compliance. So the first thing you need to know is the WCAG, and that doesn't mean you have to memorize it, but you need to know the basic. At least you need to read all of it. So that's your step one. You have to read all of it. I have done that a few times and it is not pleasant, but just turn on a Pomodoro timer, take notes, read it. You don't have to memorize it, but basically if you're in an interview and they ask you, is alt text for images in the WCAG, then you need to say yes or no. Basically, that's the level of knowledge you need to have. So you read it, you don't have to memorize it, and then you also need to refresh it. So prepare some flashcards and then quiz yourself at least once a week and before every interview. That's step number one. So read the WCAG, learn it. Now, step number two is as you read the WCAG, you read about different types of people with disabilities. So you need to read up on those disabilities and medical conditions that affect people that makes it difficult for them to operate the web if the web is not accessible. I'll give you an example. People who have multiple sclerosis, a common symptom is hand tremors. And then we have a WCAG AAA success criteria that says, okay, so your target size must be at least 44 by 44 pixels because people with tremors can have difficulties using their fingers, either with a mouse or on their phone. If the fingers have tremors, it's difficult for them to click on or tap on tiny targets. Another thing, I'll give you an example, is that there are different types of epilepsy, and people with photosensitive epilepsy are vulnerable to multiple flashes in the video, which is why we have a success criteria that says, okay, your video must not have an X amount of flashes in X amount of time, or it might trigger people with photosensitive epilepsy. So these are the kind of things you need to know. It doesn't mean you have to be a medical student or to know everything about treatments, all the symptoms, but you need to have at least basic understanding. And actually, if you have friends and family who have those conditions, then you can also talk to them and they can also help you. So we have the WCAG, we have knowing about medical conditions and disabilities. The other thing is you need to have a basic understanding of screen readers and assistive technologies such as screen magnifiers and speech recognition software. And every computer has a built-in screen reader. So if you're on a Mac, you have VoiceOver. If you're on Windows, you have Narrator. So I think Linux has its own screen reader. I think it's called Orca, but I'm not entirely sure. But all computers have a built-in screen reader. So you can just turn it on and play around with it and see how it acts and what it says. I think those are the three most important things that every accessibility professional must know. So if you're just starting out, then yeah, you just have a lot of studying ahead of you. The next question is, do I need to memorize the WCAG to find a job in accessibility? No, you don't need to memorize it, but you need to have a working knowledge of the content. And you need to learn success criteria, single A and double A, especially well, because single A and double A are required for every website for conformance. And then triple A, it's good to know triple A success criteria. But what I do is I have written a bunch of flashcards. You can use Anki, or I like a different program for flashcards, different from Anki, but Anki is really good and it's really accessible, though I haven't tested it, but Anki is really good. And just make sure that you quiz yourself once a week. If you have a friend who works in accessibility, you guys can study together, especially before an interview. Just go through your flashcards. There is this really good book about learning how to learn, it's called, with a red cover. This book is amazing in how to learn things. So it talks about deliberate practice, how memory works, how sleeping is very important for memory. So that's what you need to know about the WCAG. So the next question is, how many screen readers do I need to know how to work with in order to get a job in accessibility? So there are 5 screen readers: NVDA for Windows, JAWS for Windows, VoiceOver on macOS, VoiceOver on iOS, and TalkBack on Android. And of course, the more screen readers you know, the better, or it also depends on the company. For example, when I worked at Microsoft, I became really good with Windows Narrator because we were required to make sure our code works with a lot of screen readers. And of course, Narrator is the default screen reader of Windows. So I had to test a lot of my code on Narrator. But for example, if you have a job at Apple, VoiceOver is going to be probably the main screen reader you test with. But no matter what kind of accessibility job you have, you would at some point have to test with a few screen readers, and probably 5 of them, because you have NVDA, JAWS, that's Windows, and if your iPhone, that's VoiceOver, and then a lot of phones are Samsung, so that's TalkBack for Android. So, and again, you don't have to know all the hotkeys and everything and all the combinations, but you need to know at least how to work with it. And when I interview people for jobs, if we want to see how they know how a screen reader is working, we usually ask them simple questions, because if you don't know the simple question, then you're not going to know the advanced question. So we ask things like, okay, what is a rotor in VoiceOver, right? What is an elements list in NVDA? Things like that. How to browse an app via headings in TalkBack, something like that. Basically, I think someone compiled accessibility question for screen readers you can also search. But I think one of the things you do is, just practice and study. And so, yeah, you need to know 5 screen readers to get a job in accessibility. That is if you want to be an accessibility tester or programmer, if you're really, really working in accessibility. Now, if you want to be accessibility program manager, then obviously you don't need to know all 5 of them. But at the same time, let's say you and some other person are both up for accessibility program manager position, right? And you know all 5 screen readers and the other person knows 1. Obviously, you're going to get it if you know more than the other person, right? So the more you know, the better. And again, just focus on the famous screen readers, but it also depends on the kind of job you have. Like if you're interviewing for Microsoft and you're really good with VoiceOver and VoiceOver on iOS, and they ask you about Windows Narrator, then you can be, if you know Windows Narrator, so if you prepare before that, you'll be like, yeah, I know Narrator, and then give some examples, then the chances of you getting a job are much higher, right? Which is funny, because when I was interviewing for the Microsoft job, they asked me if I had any experience with Windows high contrast mode, and I said, no, I have never worked with Windows high contrast mode. And they're like, okay, honesty is good, but it's still a good idea to prepare for the kind of products. Next question is, what do you think of AI-powered accessibility overlays? Yeah, they're trash. So you've probably seen, you've gone to a website and have an accessibility overlay. When you click on it, they have all that bunch of different controls and options. And for someone who's not disabled and doesn't use assistive technology, they probably think it's very cool, but it's not. A lot of those options already exist in the browser. They're just put on top of the website all over again, encoded, and a lot of them are not accessible. But basically, using an accessibility overlay is like seeing a crack in your wall and just putting duct tape on it. It just hides the problem, but the crack in the wall is still there and it's still causing structural damage. Or if you're an accessibility company, and I see that excuse a lot, if you're a company and you always say, oh, I don't have money to hire an accessibility expert to make a website accessible, and I have the money to hire a company. Well, every time you have a business, you have expenses, right? And I have seen business owners spending so much money for the dumbest things possible. T-shirts, pens, coasters with their logo on it. And yeah, it feels good, but how is that going to help a disabled person going on your website if they want to buy, for example, a lot of your products, right? If they see your website is not accessible, they're just going to leave. So instead of buying 500 T-shirts and spending thousands of dollars on pens, okay, maybe have that money to have an accessible website, right? So it really depends as a business what you want to spend your money on, right? There's never going to be enough money for everything. So even the wealthiest people in the world, they cannot just buy anything they want. They still have to budget. And another example of accessibility overlays is ostriches. So when ostriches run, they bury their heads in the sand. But the lions are still chasing them. So basically, companies who use accessibility overlays, it's like those ostriches burying their heads in the sand, and then they get eaten by the lion, because even though you cannot see the lion is after you. So yeah, don't use accessibility overlays. Next question is, what software do you use to write down accessibility reports and audits? So I use Google Sheets, but if you're working in the company, they usually have their own program that manages tasks. So for example, one of the companies I worked on, we filed all of our accessibility issues on Jira, right? We would just create accessibility tickets for each defect. Yes, that was a lot of tickets that I have written. So I can also make a video about how to write an accessibility report, because it's tough, especially when you're first starting out. But I use Google Sheet. Next question is accessibility difficult, or am I just not smart enough to learn? No, accessibility is difficult, but usually it's highly paid, similar to programming. And so no matter what your job is, a tester, a designer, a program manager, a programmer, there's just a lot of disabilities to keep in mind. Then you need to know what's in the WCAG, what's required for conformance or compliance. For example, the new Accessibility Act in Europe, right? Now that is something that companies have to comply to, and you need to know about that. But accessibility is a deeply fulfilling career, because the amount of people you help is enormous. And also, no matter what job you have, even if you need to know a little bit of accessibility, you have much easier time finding a job. If you're a designer who does accessibility, and you also be better at your job, right? Because everyone likes looking at designs that have good contrast. Nobody likes to squint to read light gray text on a white background. And then have the other question is, what is it like working in accessibility? So I've had a few accessibility roles, and it really depends on your team and the company culture, right? I think one of the best teams I've been at is each person have different specialization. So for example, usually I'm the web accessibility expert of the team. There's a person who does TV accessibility, another one who does mobile accessibility. We're basically like doctors. So you have different doctors that treat different types of conditions, and we all help each other. It's interesting and fun. I will say though, I think one thing that accessibility people struggle with, or any knowledge field worker, is we're afraid to ask questions because we're afraid of looking not smart. So I suggest, if you have other people on your team and they're smart and they do their job well, just ask them questions and try to learn from them. And you can even do that in private, right? This way it will really help you build your accessibility knowledge, because we all have to learn somehow, and you cannot learn if you don't ask questions. Okay, so those are all the questions I have so far. Feel free to write down in the video description if you have any questions. And yeah, thank you for wanting to make the world more accessible, and I'll see you next time. Oh, and subscribe to my channel and like this video. Oh, I also have an accessibility blog on Medium. It's in the description. So yeah, check that out.